I want to welcome all of you to 1541, the last class of the semester, where typically we have guest speakers to tell us about the future of finance and the finance of the future. Given what's happened this year with intelligence, particularly artificial intelligence, and then, of course, the question about what the role of human intelligence is, we thought that we would focus our panel discussion on three experts in the area of intelligence. To my immediate left is Daniela Rus, a professor of computer science and the head of the CSAIL, the Computer Science and AI Lab. She's a roboticist as well as a data scientist and AI expert, and she'll be talking about liquid networks for learning control. To her left is Josh Tenenbaum, a professor of brain and cognitive sciences, and one of the new generation of computational neuroscientists who've been thinking about intelligence in some very deep ways. And we're going to be hearing about how ChatGPT really has changed the landscape, but maybe in ways that you might not expect. And last but certainly not least, to his left is Sandy Pentland, professor of media arts and sciences at the MIT Media Lab. Sandy has done so many different things, including robotics and AI, and he'll be talking a bit about the financial landscape with respect to digital assets and cryptocurrencies. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I thought we would begin by asking each one of the panelists just to say a few opening remarks. So Daniela, perhaps we start with you, and if you don't mind. And a special thanks to Daniela for making her way here across the campus on crutches. It's very grateful for that.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here with all of you. So it's really a fantastic time for AI and for our work. And as head of CSAIL, I'm asked often what the future holds and what our lives will be like. And honestly, I believe that AI will make our lives so much better and in so many ways, some of which we have only begun to imagine. But at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that there are significant challenges, both technological and societal challenges around AI. So, despite the great opportunities in AI that you may have heard about, there are a lot of technical challenges. And first among the AI challenges is the data itself, because AI requires huge data availability. Much of the data has to be manually labeled. And this is not easy to do at the scale that the data is needed. Also, huge data means huge models, which in turn means a huge computation cost and a huge environmental cost. The sustainability cost, the carbon cost of AI is very large, and we have not begun to talk about that extensively enough. Now, because the models that we build tend to be very big, they also tend to be black boxes, and we don't actually understand how the systems make their decisions. And then we have some robustness and trust challenges. And I want to explain these challenges in the context of a robotic driving application. This is the MIT self-driving car, and it does really well. It uses a deep neural network to drive, to do point-to-point navigation and recognize where it is located and recognize where it's supposed to go. So now let me open the hood for you and show you what is happening inside this deep neural network engine. And to get you oriented, in the lower right-hand side, you see the map of the vehicle. In the upper left-hand side, you see the camera input stream, the sensor based on which the car makes its decisions. And the big rectangular box with green, blue, and yellow blinking lights is the decision-making engine that consists of about 100,000 artificial neurons and about 500,000 parameters. And it is absolutely impossible to say what is how the car decides. We cannot make correlations between the patterns of the neurons and the behavior of the vehicle. And furthermore, if you look in the lower left-hand side of the slide, that is the attention map. That means what you see there is where in the image the car looks in order to make decisions. And in this example, you see that the car mostly looks at the bushes and the trees on the side of the road to make decisions about how to steer. Now, as compared to this, we have developed a new approach to machine learning we call liquid networks. And now you can see the liquid network solution for the same version of autonomous driving. And in this case, we have 90 neurons, and we have a much cleaner attention map. And this attention map is focused on the road horizon and the side of the road. And so at this point, given that the new model is so small, we can extract decision trees that are human understandable. We can also interrupt the execution to see exactly how the neural pattern associates with behavior. So this is very exciting because we're moving towards compact, explainable, and understandable networks. And by the way, these networks are also provably causal, which deep neural networks are not. So you can, in fact, take this solution and apply it to domains where you have time series data. So the solution does not work for domains where you have only static data as input. But if you have time series, like in finance or like in language or with sensors, then you can apply this model. So here you saw an 11-node neural network that is able to avoid obstacles and hit these balls that happen at fixed points at unknown points in space. All right, so these neural networks, these liquid neural networks, are part of a class of continuous time neural networks, which includes standard recurrent neural networks, neural ODEs, and continuous time recurrent networks. But it turns out that despite the fact that we can have a continuous formulation to the problem, which kind of captures a lot of the properties of the problem in the function itself, in the differential equation, that represents the network, it turns out that, in fact, despite these elegant formulations, these networks, these existing networks, do not do so well. So here's a very simple task where we're trying to teach a two-dimensional cheetah how to walk. And you can see that, in fact, the continuous time solutions do not do better than the discrete LSTM solution. However, liquid networks do better. So how do we achieve this? Well, we achieve this by changing the function of the neuron and the wiring in the network. So the function of the neuron starts with a well-behaved state space model, which we introduced to increase the neural stability during learning, and then we introduce nonlinearities on the synapses. And if we plug the two equations into each other, we get the equation that defines the neural activity in a liquid network, and we see that, in fact, the function f actually impacts not just the output of the neuron, but also the constant in front of the x of t. And so we call them liquid time networks because essentially the constant in front of x of t depends on the input. And that actually makes these networks able to adapt and change their underlying function based on the inputs that they see. So I told you that we do two things. We actually change the function of the neuron. We also change the wiring. And altogether, we obtain these great solutions that end up being much more robust, explainable, provably causal, and compact. And so here you can see in video comparisons between liquid networks and other types of solutions, LSTM, CTRNNs, and CNNs. And you can see that liquid networks are the only ones that seem to understand the task where their function is focused on the road horizon and side of the road. It turns out that we can actually provably do this. I want to show you another example, and this one is in the case is for drones. So here the task is to find an object in the woods, and this is the kind of training we do with a drone. We actually don't provide any labels. We simply provide the network with these videos. And we train LSTMs and CNNs. We train a whole wide range of machine learning models using this data. And now if we try to execute our solution or the solution, of the trained model in a slightly different environment, you can see that a standard deep neural network gets really lost. Look at the attention map. This is why the solution is confusing. But now also notice that we trained the system during the summer when the background was green, and we're trying to execute it for inference in the fall when the background looks very different. And so since a standard deep neural network looks at the context extensively to decide what to do, it cannot do the task. But on the other hand, the liquid network solution has no problem because the solution is causal and really focused on the task. And so here, if you look at the attention map, the solution goes straight to the object. And this can be done in all kinds of environments. So the point is, and you can see the comparison, the liquid nets are very focused on the task. Everybody else is kind of focused on the context. And so generalizing for training in one environment to a different environment, zero shot, works well with liquid networks, but does not work with other models. And so I just mostly wanted to show you this as a way of saying that we do have challenges in AI, but the technical community is really hard at work to resolve those challenges, to come up with solutions for interpretability, for robustness, for compactifying the solutions and reducing the data required by these systems. So I'm going to leave you with this video that shows the exact same model that was trained in the summer in the woods to find the static object. And now with zero shot, this solution is actually able to track the object in a completely different environment, in a dynamic setting rather than static setting. So I think I've used up my 10 minutes. I just want to say that I'm very excited about AI and about how AI is going to impact our lives and is going to bring new capabilities, efficiency, is going to give us superpowers. But at the same time, we have many issues, many societal issues that we need to think about as we consider deploying machine learning extensively. And this includes the impact on the workforce, because many of the roles that people have today could, in principle, be replaced by machines. So what happens to those people? Every time you use data, there is a risk to privacy and to trust. There is also the possibility that governments use that data authoritative governments will use that data to control people. There is the possibility of creating disinformation. And there is also the possibility of using too much machine learning without controlling the resources we use, and that could have a significant impact on climate. So with that, I will stop and pass it on to my esteemed, back to Andrew, who will probably introduce my next esteemed colleague.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Josh? Okay. Thank you for having us here, and that was really cool stuff. I've seen some earlier versions of that, but it's great to see the progress, Danielle. So I'm Josh Tenenbaum. I'm a cognitive scientist and also a cognitive AI researcher. I'm in brain and cognitive sciences at MIT, but also CSAIL and part of CBMM, the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and the Quest for Intelligence. And what we're doing in the different sides of our work and in these different units and with a number of many great colleagues and students at MIT and beyond is really a joint project of trying to both understand how intelligence arises in the human mind and brain, and also to use what we learn to engineer more human-like forms of machine intelligence, or machines that are intelligent in more human-like ways. Okay? We do that because the science, which is fundamentally my goal, as much as I love AI, and I have always been fascinated by it, I just want to be very clear to everybody that my fundamental, deepest interest is in how the human mind and brain works. But the way we approach that is like an engineer. So I'm especially interested in learning from and also contributing to the engineering side of intelligence, because we feel that just as you might, you could debate what's the best language to capture how the physical world works, or biology, and there's different mathematical formalisms and other such things. But if we want to say what's the best way to understand how the brain and the mind work, it's computation. I think there's broad consensus of that. And of course, what it means to be a computer, or what kind of computation is cognition, that's an evolving concept. But that's what our work is really trying to figure out most fundamentally, is what kind of computation is cognition? And how can we build that kind of computation in machines that we design and use to achieve the most optimistic vision that we all want to see in the world? Okay. And it's really, to me, it's motivating to reflect on what are the gaps between today's AI and what our brains and minds do. And of course, those things are changing all the time. That's why it's such an exciting and dynamic time, right? The way I think we've always understood AI on the engineering side is artificial intelligence is a moving target that is basically defined by machines doing things that we used to think only humans could do. And so that's by definition a moving target, right? Things like, for example, your GPS system that finds a route through, a map, tells you what's the best way to get from point A to point B in a city or across the country. That used to be something only humans could do. The algorithms for doing it were originally developed by AI researchers, right? You actually knew them personally, right? Like people at the SRI AI lab who developed algorithms like A* for robotic planning, like for the famous shaky robot, right? And now those algorithms have just become part of modern computing, and we use them in all sorts of technology applications. We don't even think of them as AI anymore, okay? But so much of modern computing was originally developed for the goal of trying to get machines to do things that, at that point in time, only humans could do. So where are we right now? We have all these amazing machines that do things we used to think only humans could do. For example, self-driving cars. We don't have totally full self-driving, but we've made amazing progress, and that's playing out in ways to keep us safer, like the Toyota projects that Daniela has led, for example, in emphasizing how can we get systems that don't ever let you crash. Or, the vision of Tesla and others is okay, well, can you actually just go to sleep in the back seat and wake up at your destination with perfect trust? And we're still pretty far from that, especially in any, to have a car that could drive anywhere a human can, including out in the woods, including all these places. But, progress is being made, okay, on many of these fronts. And whether it's machines that beat the world's best players at Go, or the latest developments, of course, everybody's talking about ChatGPT, large language models. In any conversation I'm in, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but pretty much in any conversation I'm in with somebody I haven't seen in a little while, I have this mental clock in my head. Okay, when are they going to mention ChatGPT? And I don't know if it's just they want to talk to me about it, or everyone wants to talk to everyone about it. I don't know, but this is. What I used to say is, we have all these AI technologies, but we don't have any machine that can do all the things that a human does and do it all for yourself. You, unlike self-driving cars, let's say, you're not built by dedicated teams of engineers to do what you do. You're built by evolution, and that includes your genetic endowment, the program that builds your body and your brain. It also includes the learning algorithms that evolution gave you. It also includes the knowledge landscape that you emerge into that's a product of cultural evolution of humans as well as biological evolution. But there is a fact that your brain and mind, you're born into the world, and then growing up in a good environment, as hopefully most of you have grown up in, you just learn to do all the things that you learn to do and want all the things you want and know and understand all the things you do. You do all those things for yourself, and we don't have any AI system with that kind of general, flexible common sense that even a young child has. That's still true. But we have some things, some remarkable advances like ChatGPT and so on, that in some quarters kind of look like that or are sometimes advertised as being like that. And I'm happy later on to talk about many of the gaps in sorts of things and what do we really mean by intelligence and what are the differences. Okay, and I think it's important for me to be mindful and to talk about those gaps while also being extremely impressed at remarkable advances, and I work on some of these myself, so I wear multiple hats. But again, just think about I mean, again, I think it's also important to say that like technologies like large language models are being designed with great financial incentives, both rewards and costs, to, among other things, to do many useful things, but also to convince all of us that they are AGI things. And we should keep that in mind from a finance and a behavioral finance point of view, because that's very much in play here. But again, just reflect on all of the things that, that when we have like a large language model that we can have a conversation with about anything, and it's incredibly fascinating, right? That machine, what it does is in some sense one thing, which has a conversation, although that's a general version of that task. When humans, when we have conversations with each other, we think, and it's a reasonable bet, that we use all of our general intelligence to do that. But that doesn't mean that when a machine does that, it's using the same kinds of general intelligence that we use. The intelligence that we use, for example, to drive a car. ChatGPT doesn't drive a car, okay? People are using large language models together with other kinds of systems to control robots, and we should talk about that. It's very interesting. Again, I think we're even, as we speak, some of our students are writing collaborative NeurIPS papers on this topic. But still, a model that's trained to predict the next token in text doesn't do things except write more tokens in text. It doesn't drive a car. It doesn't walk and get into the car. It doesn't adapt when it breaks its ankle and has to deal with crutches and a brace or what was that thing you were on before, a knee scooter, right? All the ways that we flexibly adapt to situations kind of without thinking about it, except there's a lot of computation going on behind that, right? It doesn't come up with the idea that it wants to learn to drive, doesn't invent cars, it doesn't invent wheels. Just think about all the things that humans, both today and over our cultural legacy, have used our intelligence for, and what we've wanted to do, right? It doesn't play Go. It doesn't know about, It can learn lots of patterns in Go games, but that's not the same thing as like actually wanting to play a game, right? Let alone driving to the Go match, caring if the match is interrupted, coming up with the idea that maybe there could be other games that we haven't thought about before, and finding that motivating and interesting, let alone getting other people to do that. So these are just a sample of the sort of activities that human intelligence, both in any one of us and culturally, has been about, and we'd like to understand what are the computations that support that. Okay. Fundamentally, I think the basic challenge is that so much of recent AI has been driven by machine learning and the idea specifically of like finding patterns in data sets and approximating functions. And again, I really like the work that Daniela is doing and was talking about here, and showing how you could learn from less data and have smaller models and interpretable models and so on. But when you study intelligence in the mind and brain, you realize it's not just about learning. And learning is not just about pattern recognition. So the fundamental thing that our group tries to work on, and that we're really interested in going forward and understanding how this how we can build machines like this, how it can scale if we could put anything even remotely like the level of investment, financial and technology know-how and cultural interest in this approach to scaling intelligence the human way that has been put into machine learning. I'd really like to see where that goes. But this is basically the abilities the interest in, the motivation, and the capacities that let humans understand the world. If you want to know what intelligence is, look maybe to the original meaning of the word. The Latin root intelligence comes from intelligere, as our colleague Tommy Poja pointed out long ago when we started something called the Intelligence Initiative. It means to understand. Intelligence isn't a set of abilities that come from learning. It's the capacity to understand the world and the desire to understand the world that lets us do all these things and so much more without so much data, right? To explain what we're seeing, to think of things that nobody's ever seen, to make plans to solve, to achieve those things, to solve problems that come up along the way, to share our models, to grow knowledge culturally, to learn from each other, and to even try to understand what is our capacity for understanding. So learning is a part of that, and pattern recognition is a part of that. But we're also interested in what are the computations that underlie our abilities to model the world, to model each other's minds, so-called theory of mind, to create meaning together in language, and to create knowledge together. and deeper kinds of meta-knowledge, if you like. In some sense, maybe the deepest notion of understanding is the knowledge that lets us sustain and grow new knowledge and new competencies in a changing world, a world that's always changing, that we are changing, that we're creating and recreating, and understanding in order to change, we hope, for the better. Okay? So that's a significant difference than what today's AI technology is doing, but we know there's an existence proof. Each and every one of us has a supercomputer inside our head that does that. And it's not just inside our head, as I hope Sandy will talk about. It's really a kind of collective intelligence, and evolution created us to have intelligences which work best together. So we'd like to understand that, and at this point, I think it's more than time for me to hand it over to the collective intelligence of my last colleague.
Thank you, Josh.
Hey. So what do you want me to talk about?
Oh, sorry, I shifted to make you talk about collective.
No,
talk about whatever you want.
It's okay.
You've worked on so many of these things over the
Yeah,
years.
so I mean, I used to teach with Jeff Hinton, and then I decided that deep neural nets were not going anywhere. And I was correct for almost 30 years, right? The way I think about all the large language models like ChatGPT is what Marvin Minsky used to say is the biggest problem in AI is common sense. Now, common sense is not necessarily very, intelligent. It's just what everybody believes, right? And that's a pretty good model of what these language models do. It's just what everybody talks about. Some of it's BS, right? But it is the glue that we use to tie together lots of other things, like, for instance, learning from each other, as you mentioned, but also multiple intelligences. And so what you're seeing now, like, for instance, some of my friends just built a large language model that is comparative to GPT-3 that fits in your phone, cost them $600. That means you're going to see these sorts of competencies everywhere. You're going to see it in your thermostat. I mean, it just is going to be everywhere. And that's the thing you need to begin thinking about. And they're going to have multiple intelligences because they're going to have little deductive engines in there, and they're going to learn and watch from each other, so there are a network of learners. And that's where it gets really interesting and really scary. So I thought I'd sort of start off with that, but you asked me to talk about crypto and stuff like that. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then maybe I'll put the two together, okay? So recently people have somehow decided I know something about finance, which Andrew will consider hilarious. I consider hilarious. But I'm an advisor to the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. So that's the problem of how do you make $1 billion a day? Right? That's what you do if you have $1 trillion, right? And advise.
Hard in that case.
Well, no, it actually is hard,
okay.
right? Because you got to do it for the next 30, 50 years. It's like, so you got to think about where the world is going. And I advise the OECD and the UN and people like that too on these things. When you think about crypto, you think about Bitcoin and Ethereum and all the variants thereof. And that, of course, has been this huge, I would sort of describe it as a merry-go-round Ponzi scheme. You make money off of volatility in finance. I hope you guys all understand that, right? And so this is the biggest volatility you can get, right? And it's had enormous effects. For instance, estimates are that something like $1 trillion of money has illegally been taken out of China to invest elsewhere using these methods. About half of North Korea's ICBM program has been paid for by hacks on this type of system. So it's done good things for you, maybe if you don't mind high prices of apartments because everybody invested in apartments and you don't mind being under nuclear threat from a really crazy person. But I think that area is coming to an end. So Gary Gensler, who's head of the SEC, was a visitor here, taught classes with us on these sorts of things. And he's a true believer that this stuff is going to get regulated. So it's going to have know your customer. It's going to have travel rule, which means chains of custody, so that you know who started what, who gave you this thing. You can find the bad guys if you have to. EU regulation around AI is requiring that you be able to identify humans versus AIs versus other things. That means you need to have chain of custody for anything, including social media comments. You say, why are we going to have know your real authentication of identity and chains of custody for social media? So one of the things that ChatGPT is going to do is I expect in the next year, you might see 95% of all social media, all Yelps, all review, all sort of, 529, what is the political survey type stuff, be fake. Because ChatGPT can generate very inexpensively human-sounding things that are essentially impossible to detect. And they can customize it for you. So I can set up a whole set of people that watch what you do and try to persuade you to do things. And we know from a lot of experiments with this sort of stuff that that is insanely effective. I mean, you may remember a long time ago, Milgram's experiments, where he was able to convince people to kill other people, right? Just by putting on a lab coat and saying, no, the protocol says you have to go up another notch when you shock the guy. Yeah, we're like that, okay? So that's what we're going to see. And the only way that we can sort of figure to get around it is to know who you're talking to. If you can just filter out all the bots, which requires know your customer and chain of custody, then you can do it. If you don't do that, that's the end of democracy. I'm sorry. That's the end of lots of things. Examples of this are things like that are sort of moving in this direction. You're all familiar with Silicon Valley Bank collapse. So that was essentially a social media subreddit getting all worried. So people withdrew money, had a run on the bank collapsed. And then you might have noticed in Deutsche Bank, there was a lot of wobbles recently. So some of the people I talked to think that that was actually a state operation where a nation, not to be named, but you can guess, was putting comments in lots of social media, which caused people who are large depositors to get nervous and begin to withdraw money. So now just take that and square it and square it. So that's the scary part of it, okay? Pay attention. And that's what Gary Gensler wants to stop. And that's what the EU wants to stop by putting regulation, not only on sort of crypto things, but on messaging of all sorts. You have to be responsible for what you do, is the bottom line on that. But all of this stuff obscures what I think is the bigger story for a class like this. So for instance, we worked with Maersk. They have put all of their container shipping on what you'd call a crypto chain. It's a blockchain with tokens. It's tokenization of shipping. $4 trillion a year, as far as I can figure, worth of shipping being put on a blockchain tokenized system along with customs and payments. Payments aren't quite there, but that's what's happening. Another one is SWIFT, the one that moves the money around, right? Is testing as we speak a distributed ledger system which they expect to be handling. It's a tokenized distributed ledger system that's like Ethereum, except you have secure identity. They expect that to be something like $4 trillion worth of payments in a year or two. Those are big. Pay attention. We've also worked with Switzerland to set up a system that's like Ethereum. It's called the Swiss Trust Chain, if you want to see it. It runs out of the post office. And it's for handling medical data. It's for handling payments. It's for handling other sorts of data. It's interesting. So you now have these secure ways of doing transaction using this types of things. We're beginning some work with Singapore. We've done other work with Singapore in this area. Just signed today an agreement with Indonesia to do carbon tracking and tracking of logistics chains using these technologies. We've worked with Australians for the last few years to do the same sort of thing in medicine. And we're just talking today also with the Luxembourg folks about doing the same type of thing. So what's happening is all these things that are different rails different methods, a lot of them paper, obviously, but forget the paper. They're just sort of incoherent, different ways of getting things done, are becoming smooth and uniform, all on encrypted blockchain-type systems with smart contracts, so things that say what you can and can't do with them. And those smart contracts can be large language models. So your money can have common sense, right? That's pretty interesting. And already you see traders doing this sort of thing, okay? Not completely, but getting there. Now you think about Silicon Valley Bank. So let's see, if $4 trillion a year is moving around, that it's all sensitive to, say, what the New York Times prints, what's that going to do to the stability of banks, right? New York Times sort of says, oh, these guys are screwed up in some way, and suddenly all of their deposits disappear, right? I mean, we have to do something about this, okay? And of course, it's not just money, although money tends to be the thing that you focus on, because using these things, what you're seeing, as I mentioned with the Swiss, it's medical data. It's also transactions and trade of all sorts. One of my favorite things, a friend of mine put up a tokenized system where what he was doing is selling crypto, okay, raised $1 billion, but the $1 billion was to build a hydroelectric plant. And those tokens that you put your money up for, right, turned into things you could redeem for electricity. So this sort of very distant, isolated valley in Pakistan now has a hydroelectric dam where people pay for their electricity by the investment tokens that they bought a couple of years ago. And in Pakistan, I'm sorry to say there's a lot of shenanigans, corruption, things like that. But they were able to do this because these sort of systems are auditable in a way that normal systems aren't. So there's a real upside to these sorts of things. Another thing that's distinguishing here is that this hydroelectric thing was essentially an LLC, right? But an LLC with 1 million members. You never see that. It's too difficult to administer, but not with these sort of technologies. It really changes what you can do. And now you add the fact that you can have a fairly competent common sense thing on your phone helping you invest. And unfortunately, yours is likely to be like his is like yours. And so we're like to all sort of act together. We have to sort of figure out how these little AIs talk to each other so we don't get instant runs on the bank all the time. That would be a good thing to think about. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Sammy. So I have a ton of questions, and I know our audience members do too. I'm going to ask a few, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So Daniela, let me ask you to comment on another specialty of yours that you didn't say too much about, which is robotics. Clearly, Japan has doubled down on robotics for their aging population, and you see the examples of robots that are going to be helping housework and dealing with keeping the older subjects safe. Where do we stand in robotics in this country? And more generally, do you see robotics having the impact that all of us sort of dream of, the Jetson kind of future? Or is that just a pipe dream?
Well, it's certainly my dream and my aspiration, Andrew. So I mean, it's true that Japan invests in robotics in extensive ways. I would say that Japan is really good at robotic hardware. So there's a lot of development of novel sensors, novel actuators, novel robotic bodies. But a robot is actually body plus brain. Mm-hmm. So you need both. If you have only the hardware part, then you have some cool mechanisms. If you have only the software part, then maybe you have some math and some simulations. In order to have a device that has a real impact onto the world, you really need to think about the connection between body and brain. And you need to think about where the body and the brain kind of blend together to deliver value. So I will talk a little bit about economics, and then I will say a few words about science. So from an economics point of view, there are so many areas where robots are ready to make a big impact. And in particular, navigation is really quite well studied and solved in many ways. Now, we cannot have robotaxi. The reason we cannot have robotaxi is because the perception and control aspects of a machine still have a lot of uncertainty in the kinds of human-centered environments that we expect robotaxi to be deployed. So, like on the mass bike, no way. Right? But we can have autonomous vehicles in simpler environments where things move at lower speeds and where there is much less going on in the environment. And this observation is causing a real revolution in the supply chain, which is in desperate need for machines because we don't have enough people to deliver the kind of economic function and value that is needed in the supply chain right now. And so we have robots used in all kinds of ways. For instance, there are startups that are doing autonomous delivery and management of containers in ports. And so this is exciting because the port operators simply do not have enough truck drivers to manage the loads and move the containers around. But with robotic trucks that can move in this much simpler environment, you have these trucks operating at night, you have these operating 24/7, and the efficiency of ports becomes much more streamlined and much higher. You also have robots in warehouses where they can do container picking or layer picking or each picking, and this is what's enabling the great service that Amazon provides in their warehouses. But you have other companies like Symbotic is deploying these amazing robotic installations that can handle so much faster and so much better hundreds and thousands of boxes and of actually, in some sense, box picking operations. So it's not container, it's not each, but it's at the box level. And we have so Symbotic is in our backyard. It's a local company. Vecna Robotics is building autonomous forklifts that again are introducing so much efficiency and that are operating side by side with people, in some sense complementing people. We have drones that are doing inventory management. So there are many ways in which robotic technologies can enhance what the human workers can do and make up for what's missing in the workforce. But all of this is based on and there are many other ways in which robots can help. Navigation is much easier than manipulation, in part because navigation just kind of works. So what do I mean by this? So most of the solutions that we deploy of robots that move in space, whether it's in the air or on the ground or in water, use laser scanners that emit light and make very, very accurate images of the environment because the light measurements are very precise. Before we had laser scanners, everyone tried to get robots to navigate using sonar. And sonar is a very imprecise sensor because unless the sonar beam is in a very narrow cone, that beam will bounce on surfaces and you'll get all the wrong readings. And so, like before the introduction of the LiDAR scanner, nothing worked. And then the LiDAR scanner was introduced, and all of a sudden, all the algorithms that didn't work with sonar, all of a sudden they started working because the measurement was precise, because precision and uncertainty are such important aspects of getting a robot to move. So this is all to say that actually in manipulation, we do not have yet the equivalent of the laser scanners. So we're still struggling to figure out the right kind of force and torque sensors and the right way of dealing with the world. And actually this loops us back to the observation that a machine is both body and brain. And to today we have machines that physically do more than humans can, like all the robots that we have on the manufacturing floors. They are masterpieces of engineering that can do so much more than humans can. But they are doing repetitive tasks. As soon as something unusual happens in that environment, they cannot cope. At the same time, we have this extraordinary development on the brain side, but that's not really readily deployable onto physical bodies. And so an interesting question to me is, how do you connect the two? And I want to say something to you, Josh, because you talked about how language models cannot drive cars. And so recently, I've been thinking, because it's illegal for me to drive as long as my leg is broken, it's become very, very inconvenient for me to move. And I'm not used to this. I like my independence. And then it occurred to me that with a car, we can do very precise control of the throttle and the steering. What we cannot do with a car is interpret the world around us. So if I could just sit in the passenger seat of a car and just narrate, drive straight, watch out, turn around, that guy is crossing the street, right? I could, in principle, drive my car. I guess what I wouldn't have in the car is the speed of reaction that is involved in braking suddenly if something happens, because if I had to narrate, now you have to brake, it's already too many seconds. But it's interesting to think about models that kind of combine what humans are best at and what machines can do. So I do imagine some way in which language and autonomous driving can connect
I like that example.
together.
That's great.
So anyway, so I could probably go on for the rest of the hour, but did I answer your question?
You did.
Okay.
And by the way, my wife narrates all the time when I'm driving, so I firsthand experience. But getting to the issue about the brain now, so this is exactly the point that I wanted to raise with Josh.
Yeah.
So, you made a really interesting point, which is that we've solved all of these seemingly intractable problems in AI that effectively now has passed the Turing test. I think you would argue that we've passed the Turing test, no? With large language models? No?
I mean, for the sake of argument, we can assume that we have, but we have machines that you can have a lot of different interesting open-ended conversations.
And you can't tell whether you're talking to a machine or a human.
That's not true.
It depends who's talking, right?
If you want to tell whether you're talking to ChatGPT, it's trivial. But
you'd have to know the question to ask.
Sorry, what?
I couldn't tell. You might be able to tell because you know the question to ask.
How do you tell that you talk to ChatGPT, Josh?
Ask a self-referential question, like
as an AI language model, I mean, I suppose if you wanted to have a human who was let's say the goal is to convince you that you're a human.
Yes.
Right? ChatGPT is designed to not convince you that it's a human, right? If you wanted to have a human who was trying to convince you that they were ChatGPT, well, they probably couldn't type fast enough. But that's a different story. Right. But ChatGPT is not going to fool anybody into thinking that it's a human.
But first of all, you shouldn't talk about ChatGPT because that's like a couple-year-old technology. 4 is a lot better. And if you're restricted to short, topical things like social media posts, it's very difficult to tell.
Sure, if you restrict to things that there's massive amounts of data on the internet and you learn patterns, and we could debate this, and I don't know how interesting this is, but intelligence is so much more than that I think it's not even an interesting debate.
This is what I'm getting at. You can convince humans to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do.
Right. Yeah, sure.
By using comments from these things.
Sure. So but that's not the same as passing the Turing test. That's some really evil, dangerous thing that hopefully
that's right. It's a really
colleagues won't do.
So let me get to the point. The point that I was getting at was not this one. It's the point that you brought.
But let's say suppose we had AI that can quote pass the Turing test. Yeah.
It still doesn't have the quality that you suggested, which is that individuals in this room are engaged in a number of different activities during the course of the day. And they have something that...
Or the course of a life.
The course of a life, that's right. And what is that? I mean, we typically think of it as agency.
That's key. That's absolutely a key idea.
Right.
Right? I mean...
So this is exactly what I want to ask you about.
A large language model can be used as part of trying to implement an agent, and people are doing that, and it's both People have said it's the new crypto, right? But a language model itself has no agency at all.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
It's a tool. And so the question is, what's the difference between a tool and a person? And it seems to me that one of the key aspects is exactly the point you brought up about evolution. We have, all of us, hardwired in us the desire to survive.
Yeah.
And that desire, along with a few other biological necessities, we need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to procreate, those basic functions drive us.
Yep.
It's the reason that students are here looking to get their degrees and getting good jobs and ultimately want to start a family. It's all part of the hardwiring that nature has provided.
Yes.
We can do that with programs and machines too, can't we? In
I
fact,
mean, in principle.
In fact, the three of you right now, if we were to lock you away in some beautiful mountain resort and an evil Dr. Lowe, maybe, is a billionaire
I was once locked away in that place
that
with
says,
Sandy, actually.
we want you to come up with a robot that is physically separate and has agency, that the robot wants to survive, the robot wants to procreate, the robot has specific desires, goals. Are we that far away from the kind of intelligence that you study?
A lot of people believe that you can put these LLMs in feedback loops
Right.
that you've programmed, and they've done things that at least first order look like that. And that's part of the
You mean like the auto GPT sorts of
things where they reflect on themselves. But I've also seen things like the LLM Village that Bernstein created, where it had a whole bunch of people, these agents interacting with each other and throwing parties. It was what he did is he engineered in some of these social drives. Right? And they came up with, well, what's a good thing to do on a Saturday night? Well, let's have a Valentine's party, right? Oh, and you won't invite this person, but you will. So you can begin putting sort of context around these, right? And they're just a module, right? But they're a module that's pretty flexible for habits, for cultural knowledge, right? And so now you can begin building things. And they'll do a lot better than if you just had the feedback without this sort of common sense thing in the middle.
So it seems like we have all the pieces. We have all the pieces. The missing piece is that agency component that we can certainly endow.
Well, except that I think there are some things, it can do a lot of things. Like I've often thought about, and we've seen some things, combining something like Wolfram Alpha, which is this amazing deductive math engine, with LLMs like ChatGPT-4. Not GPT-4, not ChatGPT-4. And by doing sort of a reflective loop, you can begin to do things like prove real theorems. But nobody, as far as I know, has been able to say, which theorems should you prove?
Right.
There's that sense of what's important, what's with the sort of global intuition. And I have to think that that's actually grounded in our proprioception and our experience with our environment, the fact that we're embodied, the fact that we have these drives, that we find certain things interesting and certain
But
things
in
not.
order to get there, to live a lifetime and develop all of those different components is the agency that I think, Josh, you're talking about, that the intelligence that you want to create.
Well, and also Josh is talking about the comprehensive look at everything that we do. If we narrow down on a particular task, then we can do a simple reinforcement learning solution that will ensure that the agent survives. But the agent survives for that particular task and
I don't think
nothing
anyone
else.
would. Or I don't know. If we think about intelligence as we are used to using it in humans, we wouldn't say that's intelligent, right?
So one can imagine an experiment where you created a bunch of embodied agents that had the ability to act and suck energy out of the environment and stuff. And you ran them for, say, 100 million years, and you let the bad ones die out and the good ones survive. And you would get a sort of basic programming. And then through social learning, you'd have lots of experiments that you learn from each other. And that looks a lot like culture. And then you have personal experience. And it's really hard to say that the sort of transformer architectures aren't sufficient to do a pretty good job of all of that. But you need that grounding, the semantics. You need the exploration for what's a survival tactic and what isn't. And that, as we know, is fairly slow, on the order of like thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. But that could really be something that is a pretty good model of what's going on.
And it doesn't seem like we're that far away. That's what I find really both exciting and disturbing, because we could be on the verge of what Marvin Minsky has said he wanted to do. He wanted to design a computer that would be proud of him.
Yeah. No, Marvin, I have Marvin Minsky's chair, so I get to channel him occasionally, right? But he said common sense is the biggest problem, and I think it's plausible that these large language models are something like that. And he had this real belief that we would end up with a sort of a human-machine synergy, and that humans as isolated and different from other species would be done.
Yep.
And we'd now be something different. Right. And some of my philosopher friends think that that's like all
pretty clear,
okay.
pretty clearly that, I should say, it's pretty clear humans have already transformed the world and our species with our technology, including all the things we have in computing.
Like writing really changed our culture and our ability to interact.
Right.
And I mean, just in ways that we find hard to understand. If you go back and you read those sort of literature at that time, they were all worried that writing was going to destroy culture, going to destroy the state, and they were absolutely right. Mm-hmm. It did. No more kings. The religious authorities are much less powerful, et cetera, but we wouldn't go back, right? And so the question is, I think, not how can we stop this? The question is how can we make this something that's got, a transcendent sort of element to it that we feel proud of and feel like we want to be part of.
Right. So Josh, you had an observation about one of the most important things about large language models this year that...
I'm happy to talk about that, but I'd also like to, say what you're going to say. Yeah.
No, please.
I'd like to come back to actually talking about the brain too, go ahead. Yeah, say what you're...
Well, you had something, an interesting observation about the most significant aspect of large language models that happened over the last year, and what is that?
I was saying to Andrew before that, to me, the most striking moment around AI, which I think connects to a lot of the things Sandeep was talking about too, is a financial one. To me, this was the moment when Google organized a press conference to announce their answer to ChatGPT, the Bard system. They gave a press conference from their Paris office, and they had built up to this because it was clearly a threat to their core business of search. And they were like, we're working on it. We have an answer. We're going to do this, and they teased various things. And they gave this press conference, right? I didn't see the press conference live. I just read about it on what I believe to be true social media and in the news. But the striking thing was the press conference was maybe a little underwhelming in one way or another. Maybe the language model made some mistake. It got the James Webb Space Telescope and the Hubble telescope mixed up or something. But in a couple of ways, it was just a little bit underwhelming. And pretty much as a direct result, their stock dropped by $100 billion in an hour. Now, I want to ask you this. My guess is that has never happened before. Has anybody ever lost $100 billion in an hour?
Elon.
In an hour? $100 billion in an hour? I think that's a singular moment, but you tell me if that's different. I mean, any one stock.
Really?
I mean,
that's it.
Well, I don't know. There's not that many companies that can afford to lose $100 billion in an hour.
Point.
And I think that was a sign to the whole world, but especially to the leadership of Google, something they kind of already knew, but it just drove it home how existential a threat this was to them. And, for better or worse, we have entrusted a lot of our collective intelligence and well-being to some of the biggest tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And because they are, to some extent, rational actors, they're super intelligent. As many people have pointed out, it's been a while. We've already had non-human super intelligent agents that just pursue their own goals and might well destroy our world or enslave us, and they're called multinational corporations. That's already, we've had those for a while. But we've sort of more or less trusted them to pursue their rational self-interest. But what that moment signaled is that now they were under an existential threat. And they're doing all sorts of things, like I mean, in a small way, something that affects some of our colleagues is Google completely reorganized all of their machine learning and AI research. A small sign, but and many bigger signs too. But like basically, you know, all the stuff people have been noting, like the worries that tech companies are unleashing these things that they don't understand, that they can't control, that they haven't really thought through, that are unregulated. That is a worry, right? Yeah. And it's, you know, again, I would ask you to comment on this, but my sense is that, you know, that's what happens when a powerful agent is threatened, because it has a desire to survive as well, yes. Right? And so we should take note of that. We should be worried about that, you know, that's significant.
But I mean, so I work with the EU authorities on regulation. I work with the U.S. authorities. These people are like amped up like I've never seen before. I mean, probably World War II was you know like that, but no, they're definitely going for it.
Yeah. The regulators.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, because it's registering on them, right?
Yeah. It's registered on them. And actually the part that's scariest is not the Google and the Microsofts. It's the fact that anybody can now cook these up. There's enough open source out there. Yeah. There's enough sort of web crawling. There's enough state actors and terrorist actors and so forth that you can cook up really good stuff really quick, and it can be everywhere. And so the idea of being able to certify things as being non-harmful is one of the uniform things. The notion of who are you talking to? This has to have an affirmative identity attached to it. Those sorts of things, the liability, who's liable if something screws up? Currently, it's sort of vague. It's going to get a lot tighter. And this is all good, right? Because none of this actually interferes with the innovation. It just makes people think twice before they release something. And it makes them put in audit trails, right, so that you can sort of figure out if it screws up. First of all, is it screwing up? And if it screws up, you know, what part? And then you get some hint about how to fix it. But that's probably one of the more important things we can do right now.
All sorts of new business opportunities for entrepreneurs. So.
Absolutely.
And for researchers who need to figure out how to get towards certifiable solutions.
Yeah. Let me open it up for questions. Questions from the audience? Yes, over there.
My sense on that, right, is that the brand of MIT is that you've heard conversations like this and few other people have. And that gives you a sophistication and a sort of depth of insight. Not that you know the solutions, but that you at least heard that there's a danger or a problem and so forth. And the question then is, with that context, can you invent solutions that are ethical, reliable, and keep up with the other guys, right? And so that's your charge to do. And as researchers, that's our charge, is to figure out paths to do that sort of thing. And I would say, you know, the idea of being able to have audit trails for things you do and being able to monitor constantly what is the effect, the unintended effects of what you're doing, right? And, you know, you could have caricatures of that, like, can you have a sort of a test base of humans, like Nielsen Rating Service? So you deploy your thing and you ask, well, okay, all you guys out there, how did this work, right? And you say, oh my God, it's really hurting these people. We never intended that, right? You ought to keep track of that stuff constantly, and that will inspire you for better solutions. I guess that would be the type of thing that I would push for.
So just to underscore what Sandy said, MIT is such a technology-centric institute. One thing you can take from MIT is this idea that there can be technology solutions to problems. And with respect to the really complex solutions that we talk about, I think it's important to be the expert who can articulate what can the technology do, what can't it do, what should it do, what shouldn't it do, and what must it do. Because in some sense, technology can actually bring a lot of goodness, a lot of well-being to people, and broadly. And so it's somehow our duty to do that. And so to add a little bit of color in the context of language models, I will say that much of the conversation in the press around large language models is not by experts, it's by journalists. So being the expert who really understands is going to put you, in some sense, in a special place. And now if I can say what I think you could use large language models for, I would say that large language models are very good for knowledge. So you can kind of think about a large language model as your assistant that could read an entire library of facts that is relevant to you very fast, much faster than you, and provide you with suggestions and guidance on specific information. So it will save you a lot of time. But of course, not all the facts that the large language models present to you are true facts. And in some cases, the large language models are still making egregious mistakes. That's why it's an assistant, and it's on you to know exactly what to do with the information that gets presented to you.
Can I add just one thing? So there have been a number of experiments so far using large language models as assistants in things like finance and relationships. And the distinctive thing is that they help underskilled people a lot more than highly skilled people. And they help underskilled people become highly skilled fairly quickly. So that's amazing, right? Bringing people up to snuff, right? So that you get a better workforce, better sort of set of judgments. As you say, they make mistakes sometimes, but so do humans.
So do
and
humans,
you know, if it's used as something to tell you what we normally do in this situation, which is the sort of context I'm thinking about, that's actually really important.
Yes, here and then here, down here. Up there and then down here.
Thanks very much for sharing as a finance MBA student. I want to share like Meta is the largest corporate decline in the human history, $240 billion wiped in a few hours. Not Google.
Wait, sorry, what'd you say?
Meta.
Meta.
Facebook
Meta. Yeah.
dropped $240
Billion? Yeah.
billion earlier this year.
Was that because of like an earnings report or something?
Yes.
Or? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Well, it's good to know that finance still drives finance.
Yeah.
That is good. Yes.
Okay.
And also to your point, like
No,
the
good,
investors
good. Yeah.
are not necessarily rational.
Right.
Right? The Google stock came back after whatever happened when they initially released the bars. But my question is, I have a two-part question. The first one is, given there's a lot of journalists, non-experts talking about GPT is replacing entry-level work and jobs, right? Like the junior lawyers we saw last night at 100K about document review. So what's your expert opinion on how soon that will happen? Is it going to be 2-3 years or more like 5-10 years horizon? And also, given all the ethics issues with OpenAI and large language models, do you think it's going to be just OpenAI dominating, or are we going to have multiple players? Because if we have multiple players, I personally will feel better about the future than just one company having it all.
Yeah, it's hard to see OpenAI completely dominating that space. I mean, for many reasons, including the one Sandy's saying. I mean, they've done very impressive things, and they have been, okay, let's just say there's some reasons to say that this is a very open landscape, right? It's also the case that you can see there's first mover advantages. If they convince everybody that their system is the one to use, then everybody uses it and they get more and more data. So kind of like Tesla getting a unique source of data for all the people who are buying full self-driving and paying for the privilege of training Tesla. There's lots of people, including me, who are paying for the privilege of training ChatGPT. So, there is that first mover advantage for them. But I agree with Sandy that I think this is a pretty wide open and landscape.
Every major company I know is building their own LLM using their internal documents.
Yeah, but
and it's a way of transmitting culture of the company.
Right, but just to be clear, again, in case everybody doesn't know this, it's one, and I do want to maybe come back to some of the things Daniela was saying and the brain. Okay, a language model that's trained on all your internal documents, that's trained, like the classic thing that a language model has meant for decades is training to predict the statistical structure of text. That is very useful, and that was, like up until GPT-3, that's what language models meant. And just as Sandy said, that can probably be made smaller and cheaper. And going back to what Daniela said, and some of my neuroscience colleagues like Ev Fedorenko in BCS have shown this, and I've collaborated with her, and a number of others are working on this too. Like a language model that's trained to predict, just to predict the statistical structure of text in a self-supervised way is a pretty good model of language. Language being a cognitive function that a relatively small and recently distinguished part of your brain that Fedorenko's lab and many others have studied is a chunk of your brain that is functionally specialized for processing language, for hearing a sentence and making meaning out of it, or taking a thought and putting it into a sentence. Okay, that's a very important thing that humans do. But it's not the same as common sense. It's not the same as general intelligence. It is a key enabler of distinctively human intelligence and culture, because we wouldn't have culture without that, but it's not the same as agency. It's not the same as the common sense that lets even a baby make their way through a world or learn language. Okay, so I would distinguish common sense that is necessary to learn language from all the other things that language together with the rest of the brain, our common sense knowledge systems, our agency, all those things grow.
So when companies train things, what they do is they start with a general thing, right?
That's the pure language model.
That's the pure language model, which is sort of like, how do you understand? And then they fine tune it using company documents. This is the way we speak of things at Ernst & Young, right?
Yeah, right. Well, you can fine tune it on company documents, but also like what has driven so much of OpenAI's success is various like proprietary data sources and other kinds of human feedback, so-called reinforcement learning from human feedback, which has specifically built a system designed to make a good AI chatbot, right? A system which is not something you get from just pure statistical modeling in text. So all the stuff that looks like common sense reasoning or the ability to solve problems and things like that is not coming from the language model. It's enabled by and builds on top of the language model. And OpenAI is way out ahead of that. It's much better than Bard, okay? And the more people use ChatGPT and GPT-4, the more training data they get. The more people who thumbs up and thumbs down their things, right? The more training data they get. That just like Tesla is getting an incredibly valuable source of training data. Other car companies are getting some too. But like when you use a full self-driving system and keep your hands on the wheel, every moment you're giving a lot of feedback to their system, which is incredibly valuable for them.
I just want to say that's not self-driving, but
no,
that's
I know.
a technicality.
Right, but neither is the ChatGPT AGI. The point is, it's close enough to the thing that everybody expects that people are willing to do it and even pay for the privilege of giving free training data, right? Which Tesla's figured out, and OpenAI figured that out too, and credit to them for figuring that out. Okay, but a lot of the general intelligence that you see in the OpenAI language models are coming from that. So I don't know. That's not going to be an easy thing for other companies to get. It doesn't just come from free from all the text or just the documents in-house. But I think I agree with what a lot of folks are saying here is there is huge value, and I think it's huge economic value, entrepreneurial value, tech value, and it's also more like the way the brain works. If you say, look, these large language models, just the pure language version, as a really useful tool, together with other kinds of systems for reasoning, whether it's like logical reasoning or probabilistic reasoning, and models of agency, which again, other areas of AI and neuroscience have made progress on. And you're right that we are starting to have, I don't know if we have all the pieces, but we're starting to have all the tools out there. So if you understand particularly the version of large language models that can really provide an incredibly useful and democratizing natural language interface to all these other kinds of systems for reasoning and agency, it is both, very exciting and has a lot of optimistic potential, and also very scary. But when you're making decisions about what to do in the finance world or entrepreneurial or other things like that, think about that. Don't just believe somebody's hype about this is a general intelligence system, but try to use these as tools to advance to solve the problems that we want to solve.
Great. All right, we're just about out of time. I apologize. We'd love to stay and ask you questions for the rest of the evening, but maybe in the last 2 or 3 minutes, can I ask each one of our guests here to just say a few words to our graduates about advice for thinking about intelligence in the future? What kinds of issues do you think that they ought to be focusing on? And what types of new technologies do we desperately need from the business community to support what you're all doing on the research side? So maybe we'll start with Sandy, and then Josh, and then Daniela.
Well, I'm a big fan of thinking about tokenization and this sort of notion of audit trails. So building systems like that, first of all, allow you to train things to get better, because you can see what you did in much more detail, but it also keeps you from doing things that you don't want to do, ranging from losing a lot of money to ending up in jail or starting a nuclear war, right? Yeah. And so that is, I think, the place that I would focus on, because it's really changing the capabilities of what you do.
Josh?
Yeah, I guess just extending on what I was saying, I would keep an eye out, and I'd be happy to talk to people separately about my own version of this, but there's other examples of this where, though everyone's so excited about generative AI and large language models and so on, that's just one part of the puzzle. There are other kinds of ideas about how to think about intelligence that have to do with agency, that have to do with genuine reasoning, that have to do with very flexible long-term planning. And those need the kind of scale in engineering and maturity that the machine learning pipeline has benefited from, that finance has delivered and that big tech has delivered. And I would encourage you to look for opportunities to invest in, if you're on the investment side or on the entrepreneurial side, to develop the rest of the picture, rather than letting it be dominated by just whatever today everybody is so excited about.
Yeah, that's really in line with what I think is important from the financial and investment community next, because as I alluded at the beginning of my presentation, we have some techniques about AI. AI is having a moment. We have some extraordinary techniques, but there are flaws. And so what we need to do is we need to develop the field further. And it's interesting to me that the successes that we are seeing today are due to technologies and ideas that were invented decades ago. But now they work because we have computation and we have data that was not around 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And so I believe that without new ideas and without fixings to the current problems, we are going to have increasingly more people doing the same thing, and we're going to get increasingly more incremental. So as financial experts and leaders, it's important to consider how can you make advancements in the future? How can you stimulate the right developments? How can you stimulate debiasing the machine learning models? How can you stimulate coming up with machine learning models that don't have a huge carbon footprint? How can you stimulate the development of machine learning that is explainable and auditable? And in other words, that meets a lot of the flaws that we have in our systems today. And also, when you think about AI as a tool, keep remembering that, so I'm not talking about understanding intelligence now, I'm just talking about artificial intelligence as a tool. It's a tool. And like any other tool we have, it's not intrinsically good or bad. It's what we choose to do with it. And so we should focus on on stimulating the good while figuring out how to put in place guardrails to prevent the bad.
Well, so on that note, I want to just thank all three of our speakers for being with us today. I can't imagine a better group to tell us about the future of intelligence. And thank you for all that you've been doing for this field and for society, because undoubtedly, these are the individuals that are going to be taking your ideas and implementing them over the course of the next decade or two. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all for being here. For those of you who are going to be back next year, have a good summer. For those of you who are graduating, congratulations, and wish you great success, and please stay in touch. All right, bye-bye.